Conway Twitty wasn't just a country music star, he was an empire. With record-breaking hits, business ventures, and his beloved Twitty City, he built a fortune that seemed untouchable. Fans believed his family would inherit a legacy as carefully crafted as his music. But when Conway passed in 1993, what the lawyers uncovered left everyone stunned. There was no will, no clear instructions. Instead, a courtroom battle erupted, dragging his widow and children into a feud that shattered the family for years. What they found inside Conway's estate was not just wealth, but chaos, betrayal, and a fight that still haunts his legacy today. By the late 1960s, Conway Twitty had already lived through a career arc that most singers only dreamed of. Born Harold Lloyd Jenkins in 1933, he grew up in Mississippi and Arkansas, dreaming of baseball more than music at first. Yet, by the mid-50s, when Elvis Presley was redefining the sound of popular culture, Conway, then still using his birth name, felt the pull of rock and roll. In 1958, he recorded "It's Only Make Believe," a song that catapulted him into overnight stardom. It went to #1, not just in America, but across the world, even topping the British charts. Suddenly, the boy from Friars Point was a household name. For the next several years, Conway chased that success with more pop singles, touring alongside the likes of Jerry Lee Lewis and Gene Vincent. But by the mid-60s, the tides of music were changing. The British invasion was in full swing, and younger acts were flooding the charts. Conway, pragmatic and ambitious, recognized that his career in rock and roll might not last forever. And so, in a move that surprised many, he pivoted toward country music. By the late 60s, he was performing on the Grand Ole Opry stage, slowly reshaping his image and sound to match Nashville's rising influence. The gamble paid off. By the early 70s, Conway was a dominant force in country. His single, "Hello, Darlin'," released in 1970, became his signature hit and earned him a reputation as one of the most distinctive voices of the genre. Year after year, he topped the charts with love songs that resonated deeply with fans, many of them co-written or performed with Loretta Lynn. Their duets became legendary, the 70s soundtrack for country couples in love and in heartbreak. But Conway wasn't just singing songs. He was quietly building an empire. Throughout the 70s, as he toured relentlessly across America, he invested his earnings into real estate and business ventures. He understood that music fame could be fleeting, but property and publishing would endure. In 1973, while other stars squandered their money on fast cars and parties, Conway was buying land outside Nashville. By 1982, he unveiled his crowning achievement, Twitty City. Located in Hendersonville, Tennessee, Twitty City was part theme park, part family home, and part shrine to his success. It featured lavish gardens, recording spaces, and light displays that drew tens of thousands of visitors each year, especially during Christmas. Families would travel from across the country to see the spectacle, and many were lucky enough to catch a glimpse of Conway himself, walking the grounds or greeting fans. For country music lovers, Twitty City was as iconic as Graceland was to Elvis fans, a place where the artist and the myth converged. Yet the very things that made Conway's empire dazzling also made it fragile. His business structure was complicated. Music publishing companies under his name, land holdings tied to multiple entities, and family members involved at different levels of management. By the mid-80s, his fame was still immense, but the machinery of his career required constant oversight. Conway, ever the workaholic, kept performing, recording, and touring, while also serving as the central pillar holding his empire together. Fans in those years saw only the glamour. They saw a man with 55 #1 country hits, countless awards, and the admiration of peers. But behind the curtain, Conway was stretched thin. His financial security depended not on a single bank account, but on an intricate web of assets that only he truly understood. His children and his wife, Dee, enjoyed the lifestyle his music provided, but few realized just how complicated it would be to untangle if something happened to him. That moment came in June of 1993. After nearly 3 decades of ruling the charts and a lifetime of building, Conway collapsed on tour and was rushed to a hospital in Missouri. He died from an abdominal aortic aneurysm at just 59 years old. The man who had outlasted musical fads, who had built an empire from the ground up, was gone in an instant. His family gathered, grieving not only the man, but the sudden question of what would become of his fortune. They expected a carefully drafted will. After all, Conway had been meticulous in his career, but what they discovered would leave them shocked, confused, and divided for years to come. When Conway Twitty died in June of 1993, his family braced themselves for loss. The fans lost an icon, but his widow, Dee Henry Jenkins, and his 4 children, Michael, Joni, Kathy, and Jimmy, lost a husband and father. They gathered in Nashville expecting the kind of closure that comes not just from grieving, but from a well-prepared estate. After all, Conway had built his fortune with precision. He had been deliberate in choosing his career path, deliberate in managing his business ventures, deliberate in creating Twitty City. Surely, they believed, he would have been just as deliberate in leaving instructions for what should happen after he was gone. The shock came almost immediately. As lawyers and accountants began combing through his papers in the summer of 1993, it became clear there was no will. Not a draft tucked away in a desk, not a signed document sitting in a safety deposit box. The empire Conway had built since the late 60s had no guiding hand for how it should be divided. For his family, still raw from his sudden death, the revelation was devastating. Dee expected to take control as the surviving spouse. But Conway's children, who had grown up watching their father's career climb through the 70s and 80s, felt they were the rightful heirs to his vast fortune. They remembered the tours, the concerts, the fans who packed arenas when their father was at the height of his fame. They knew how much of his success had been rooted in the years before Dee became part of his life. To them, the estate was their inheritance by blood and history. By late 1993, grief had already begun to shift into conflict. Attorneys filed petitions in the Tennessee courts, each side staking claims over royalties, real estate, and publishing rights. The music that had made Conway beloved was now evidence in a courtroom, tied to financial valuations and property disputes. Songs like Hello Darlin', once the soundtrack of love for millions, were reduced to assets in legal documents. Headlines in Nashville's newspapers carried the story into the public eye. By the mid-90s, fans were reading about bitter disputes and long hearings. Those who had visited Twitty City to see the Christmas lights or walk through the gardens now saw photographs of Dee and the children entering courthouses, stone-faced and weary. What had once been a story of music and success was becoming a story of division and heartbreak. The absence of a will created confusion at every turn. Without clear instructions, judges had to rely on probate law to determine who received what. That meant not just dividing money, but parsing ownership of companies Conway had formed decades earlier. Publishing rights, real estate holdings, touring profits from past years, even the personal belongings at Twitty City, all of it was suddenly contested. The irony was cruel. In the early 70s, Conway had carefully reinvented himself from pop singer to country star, building his career on deliberate decisions and long-term planning. Yet in death, that same discipline seemed absent. His empire, worth millions, had been left to unravel in front of lawyers, accountants, and judges. His widow and his children, instead of leaning on one another, were now adversaries in a battle that promised to stretch for years. and it did. By 1994 and 1995, the case was consuming not only the estate's value, but the family's relationships. What had begun as grief had hardened into bitterness. The family thought they would find comfort in Conway's legacy. Instead, what they found was a legal war that would outlast the mourning period and stain his memory with conflict. By 1994, Conway Twitty's death was no longer just a personal tragedy for his family. It had become a public saga. What should have been a dignified inheritance turned into one of Tennessee's longest and most bitter estate battles. In courtrooms around Nashville, his widow D. Henry Jenkins faced off against his 4 children, each side armed with teams of lawyers and accountants. Every asset Conway had touched, from his music royalties to his sprawling Twitty City complex, was now under scrutiny. In the mid-90s, the case dominated the headlines in country music circles. Fans who remembered Conway's warm voice and gentlemanly image found themselves reading about bitter depositions and legal fees that ran into the millions. For years, Conway had stood as a symbol of stability in the country world. On stage in the 70s, he was known for delivering love songs that reassured listeners, songs that promised devotion and understanding. But in the 90s, his family's battle revealed an entirely different story, one of division, resentment, and financial chaos. At the center of it all was Twitty City. Built in 1982, it had been Conway's proudest achievement outside of music. It was more than a home. It was a tourist destination, a business headquarters, and a monument to his career. For years in the 80s, families had poured through the gates to see its famous Christmas lights, lush gardens, and the personal touch of Conway himself. It was designed to be timeless, a legacy his children could inherit. Yet by 1995, it had become a financial burden. The upkeep of Twitty City was enormous. Without Conway's steady touring income, the estate struggled to keep it afloat. Legal battles drained what money was left, and the once thriving attraction began to fall into disrepair. By 1997, the financial strain was undeniable. Court filings described mounting debts, unpaid bills, and the harsh reality that the property was losing more money than it could possibly generate. The final blow came in 1998. After years of wrangling, Twitty City was sold to the Trinity Broadcasting Network. For the family, it was devastating. The place that had been both a home and a beacon for fans was now transformed into a religious campus. Visitors who once came to celebrate Conway's music were now greeted with an entirely different purpose. For fans, the news was heartbreaking. They had seen Twitty City as country music's answer to Graceland, a place where they could feel close to the man whose songs had touched their lives. To watch it vanish from the Twitty family's hands felt like losing Conway all over again. Inside the family, the wounds only deepened. Conway's children resented the years of fighting that had drained the estate of both money and meaning. They had watched their father build an empire in the 70s and 80s, only to see it dismantled within 5 years of his death. For Dee, Conway's widow, the years after 1993 were marked not only by grief, but by constant battles over houses, publishing rights, and even personal belongings that had sentimental value. By the end of the 90s, after nearly a decade of litigation, nothing felt settled. The courts issued rulings, but no decision could repair the fractured relationships. The estate was smaller, the assets fewer, the goodwill among family members gone. Fans who once believed Conway's legacy would be a story of unity now saw a family divided, with his empire slipping through their fingers piece by piece. Conway Twitty had spent the 70s and 80s building one of the most impressive careers in country music. But in death, the foundation proved fragile. His empire, which seemed so secure when the lights of Twitty City sparkled, dissolved under the weight of legal wars and financial strain. By the time the century closed, what remained was not a monument to success, but a cautionary tale of what happens when even the most careful builder leaves no plan behind. As the estate battle dragged into the early 2000s, the wounds left by Conway Twitty's passing only grew deeper. The court cases of the 90s had stripped the family not only of money, but of peace. By 2001, nearly a decade after his death, lawyers were still working through the last of the disputes. Every royalty check, every piece of property, and every residual business interest had to be accounted for. What should have been a celebration of Conway's music in the new millennium was instead a reminder of how fractured his family had become. The children, Michael, Joni, Kathy, and Jimmy, carried scars from the legal war. They had entered adulthood in the 70s, when their father was at the peak of his fame, traveling on buses, watching him perform sold-out shows, and witnessing firsthand the empire he created. To them, Conway's fortune was more than numbers on a ledger. It was the evidence of a life they had lived alongside him. But in the courtroom battles of the 90s, they saw those memories weaponized into arguments, as if their love for their father had to be proven through legal filings. For Dee, Conway's widow, the 2000s brought little relief. She had entered the marriage in the later years of Conway's life, and in the courts, she was often cast as an outsider by the children. The bitterness was personal. She had shared Conway's final years, his private joys and struggles, only to spend the years after his death defending her place in his story. What might have been a role of comfort and stability was instead defined by constant disputes. Even as rulings were issued, she was left with the sting of public judgment and the knowledge that no court decision could mend broken trust. Outside the family, fans continued to grieve in their own way. The sale of Twitty City in 1998 had been a public heartbreak, and by the early 2000s, the absence of a central place to honor Conway's memory was deeply felt. While Elvis's Graceland flourished in Memphis, drawing visitors year after year, Conway's former estate in Hendersonville was no longer his. For many, it symbolized the difference between a legacy protected and a legacy lost. Yet, even amid the turmoil, Conway's music endured. Country radio in the early 2000s still spun Hello Darlin', and the duets with Loretta Lynn remained timeless classics. Younger generations discovered his catalog through reissues and tribute shows. The irony was that while his estate was tied up in legal knots, his voice was still comforting millions of listeners who knew nothing of the bitterness behind the scenes. By 2003, the estate battles had consumed nearly 10 years. The children and Dee were left with a fraction of what Conway had once controlled. Legal fees, settlements, and property losses had reduced the fortune significantly. Twitty's empire, the publishing companies, the touring profits, the crown jewel of Twitty City, had largely slipped away. What remained were the songs, immortal on record, but stripped of the financial stability that should have supported his family for generations. For many who watched it unfold, the story of Conway's estate became a cautionary tale. Country music stars of the early 2000s, men and women who had grown up idolizing him, took notice. They were reminded that fame and fortune could vanish if not protected. Behind the headlines about new artists and chart toppers, managers and lawyers often invoked Conway's name as a lesson in planning. But for his family, the lesson was personal and painful. The early 2000s were not years of healing. They were years of realizing just how much had been lost, not only in money but in relationships. The absence of a will had done more than complicate the division of assets. It had left a void that no court could fill, a wound that time alone could not mend. Conway Twitty's children and his widow had entered the 90s united in grief. By the 2000s, they were left divided, weary, and carrying the heavy weight of a legacy scarred by conflict. As the 2000s gave way to the 2010s, the immediate legal battles over Conway Twitty's estate finally quieted, but the damage they caused never truly disappeared. His children had long since grown weary of the courtrooms, and Dee, his widow, had endured years of public scrutiny. By then, the estate had been picked apart, divided, and reduced. The fortune Conway had built through decades of touring, recording, and investing was no longer the solid foundation it once seemed. What remained was not unity, but a fractured family and a legacy that carried scars. Fans, however, kept Conway alive in memory. By the mid-2000s, tribute concerts were being staged in Nashville and Branson. Younger artists covered his hits, paying homage to the man who had set the standard for country love songs. Hello, Darlin', You've Never Been This Far Before, and the unforgettable duets with Loretta Lynn still drew standing ovations when performed by new voices. While the legal disputes had cast shadows over his personal legacy, his music endured untouched, timeless in a way the estate could never be. What haunted many was the what if. What if Conway had left a will? What if Twitty City had remained in the family, preserved as a tourist destination like Graceland? What if the fortune had been handed down smoothly, securing the future for his children and widow instead of draining them in years of conflict? Those questions lingered in the background of every article, every fan discussion, every tribute show. They were reminders that even the most successful careers could unravel without planning for the inevitable. The family's relationships never fully healed. By the late 2000s, there were moments of civility, times when the children and Dee could appear together to honor Conway's memory. But the warmth was gone. Too many years had been spent arguing in front of judges, too much money lost to lawyers. Conway's children had entered the 1990s, expecting to inherit not just wealth, but a living, breathing legacy in Twitty City. By the 2010s, all they had were memories, and the bitter knowledge of how much had been lost. For fans, the absence of Twitty City was the most visible loss. By the time Trinity Broadcasting Network fully repurposed the grounds, there was little left of Conway's original vision. The gardens and displays were gone, and the mansion was no longer open to fans. Those who had once walked through the gates in the 80s carried their photographs and souvenirs as relics of a bygone era. Younger generations, who might have visited, could only hear stories of what the place had been. Unlike Graceland or Dollywood, which became thriving tributes to Elvis Presley and Dolly Parton, Twitty City vanished into memory. And yet, Conway's songs continued to bridge the gap between generations. In the 2010s, country radio still honored him in retrospective playlists. Documentaries highlighted his unique path from rock and roll to country stardom, reminding viewers that he had not only adapted, but thrived in ways few artists ever could. He was remembered as the man who could sing a love song like no other, a voice of both strength and vulnerability. By the time the 2020s arrived, Conway Twitty's estate battles had become part of country music lore. They were recounted as lessons in what can go wrong, but they also underscored just how large his impact had been. Few artists left behind an empire so vast, and fewer still left behind one so entangled. His story stood as both inspiration and warning proof that music could build a fortune, but also that without careful planning, even the greatest legacy could unravel. For his fans, though, the legal disputes and financial losses were only part of the story. What mattered most was the music, the way Conway's voice could capture love, heartbreak, and longing in a single line. Long after the estate battles faded into history, his songs remained alive, echoing in the hearts of those who had grown up in the 70s and 80s, listening to him on the radio. And for the family, though divided and bruised, there was no denying that their father's music had left an imprint on American culture that no courtroom could erase. Still, what endures is not the bitterness of those disputes, but the music. Songs like Hello, Darlin', and his legendary duets with Loretta Lynn continue to echo across generations. reminders of the man who could capture love and heartbreak in a way few others ever could. Conway Twitty's legacy remains, but it carries a lesson. Even the greatest voices need a plan to protect the echoes they leave behind. For more emotional stories, check out this video.